everybody, it's Stella from It's Too Late to Apologize Book Reviews, and I'm here again with another book review, and today I want to talk about The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So, The Scarlet Letter was written by Nathaniel Hawthorne and published in 1850. It's a historical novel that takes place in a Puritan Massachusetts Bay colony from the years 1642 to 1649. The story is about Hester Prynne, a young married woman who through an act of adultery gives birth to a child. The normal punishment for such a sin is death. But because of the child, it is decided that she may live, but is punished by being made to stand on the scaffold in the town center for 3 hours, exposed to public humiliation, and to wear the scarlet letter A for the rest of her life. The townspeople want to know who shares in her sin so that he too may be punished, but Hester refuses to name her lover. Once released from her public humiliation, Hester goes to live in a forgotten cottage on the edge of town. Like the cottage, Hester and her child are shunned over the years, as no one allows Hester to forget the shame of the sin she bears publicly, even though she selflessly gives what little she has to perform acts of charity for the poor. Her long-absent husband, Roger Chillingworth, a physician, finds her, and while they both admit that their marriage was wrong, a loveless union, he is determined to get revenge on her unknown lover. The local minister, Arthur Dimmesdale, has an illness which is slowly eroding his health. Chillingworth goes to live with him in order to treat his mysterious ailment. Over time, Chillingworth believes that the illness is some unconfessed guilt that is plaguing the minister. Chillingworth thinks he sees a symbol on the minister's chest that represents his shame, and he comes to believe that Dimmesdale was Hester's lover and vows to ruin him. Afraid for Dimmesdale's life, Hester meets with him and tells him of her husband's revenge. She convinces him to leave Boston with her, where they can start a new life without shame because otherwise the minister will die if he stays. Dimmesdale becomes hopeful and regains a bit of his health at the hope of a new life with Hester and his child. But when the day comes to leave, the minister confesses his sin to the town and dies in Hester's arms. Soon after, Chillingworth dies also, as his revenge and purpose in life are gone. Hester leaves the village, but returns later in life and dies there and is buried next to Dimmesdale. So at surface value, this seems like a really sad, depressing story. But I enjoyed this book a lot more than I thought I was going to. The writing was so atmospheric, and while at times the descriptions were lengthy and redundant, they really gave even inanimate objects souls. It gives the reader a deep understanding of the characters and the situation. Hawthorne never leaves you to assume the scene. He painstakingly describes it. Some may not like this approach, but I really enjoyed how it painted the picture of the town and its people so intimately. Hester's shame and how graciously she bears it in the face of daily exclusion, cruelty, and selflessness is so dignified that she slowly gains the town people's confidence. People tell her their shames and she becomes a confessor of sorts because she knows shame on a personal level, to a degree that few in the town will ever openly be subjected to. She confesses her sin, and while she's excluded and never accepted into mainstream society, she can face her life. I find this really interesting because while Dimmesdale languishes in his secret sin and is literally consumed by it as the society around him holds him up in their eyes as a paragon of moral good and superiority, that this town thinks him so noble and pure furthers his guilt, and he finds himself unable to confess it until his own end was at hand. Even Chillingworth carries this secret vendetta, and it warps him physically into this twisted creature, which I find ironic since he is a doctor, in a way sort of someone who plays God himself. And while he is tasked with saving lives and encouraging life, this revenge is festering inside of him and is warping and killing him as well. The anger in Chillingworth's soul finds no peace even after his vengeance should be satisfied. This is much like Edgar Allan Poe, who Hawthorne really admired. Chillingworth could forgive Hester years prior, but he let the anger towards a complete stranger consume his life. There is this old philosophy of secrets withheld and emotions causing or being the source of illness for people. Some people still believe that to this day, and the Scarlet Letter exemplifies this. There's also this really interesting comparison between love and hate. It is a curious subject of observation and inquiry, whether hatred and love be not the same thing at bottom. Each, in its utmost development, supposes a high degree of intimacy and heart knowledge. Each renders one individual dependent for the food of his affections and spiritual life upon another. Each leaves the passionate lover, or the no less passionate hater, forlorn and desolate by the withdrawal of his object. Philosophically considered, therefore, the two passions seem essentially the same, except that one happens to be seen in a celestial radiance, and the other in a dusky and lurid glow. In the spiritual world, the old physician and the minister, mutual victims as they have been, may, unawares, have found their earthly stock of hatred and antipathy transmuted into golden love. I also find it interesting that after Dimmesdale confesses and dies, that many of the townspeople perceive the mark on his chest, the A, to be a stigmata, which only the most holy and faithful believers are graced with. Some even claim that they never saw this mark. And others refuse to connect his confession to Hester's sin, and it goes to show how people see what they want to see and not what actually is to be seen. At the beginning of the book, there's the Custom House introduction, and you don't need it at all to understand the story. It contributes nothing to the story and kind of just goes into the background of the publishing industry at the time. And Hawthorne's own grievances with it. And for the love of God, don't buy the Dover thrift edition if you can help it, because the format is terrible. But I may well just be a snob, so grain of salt there. The themes of this novel are really about revenge and penance and shame and sin, which are obvious in the book. And what I find interesting is that I find there's quite a bit of hope that Nathaniel Hawthorne writes into his story, even though all of his characters are sort of doomed in their own ways. Hester carries her burden the most publicly and is, punished so strongly for it. But I find it interesting that Hawthorne really describes her as so noble for carrying her penance so well. So it's written in here in the story about this years and years later after Dimmesdale has died. She had returned, therefore, and resumed, of her own free will, for not the sternest magistrate of that iron period would have imposed it, resumed the symbol of which we had related so dark a tale. Never afterwards did it quit her bosom, but, in the lapse of toilsome, thoughtful, and self-devoted years that made up Hester's life, the Scarlet Letter ceased to be a stigmata, which attracted the world's scorn and bitterness, and became a type of something to be sorrowed over, and looked upon with awe, yet with reverence too. And as Hester Prynne had no selfish ends, nor lived in any measure for her own profit and enjoyment, people brought all their sorrows and perplexities and besought her counsel, as one who had herself gone through a mighty trouble. I find also interesting is this idea in the Puritan colony of trying to attain this sort of spiritual perfection, and how strict and how pious the settlement was. And I find it really interesting how Hester, in her own way, becomes a part of it, even though she seems really unlikely to be that person. And I don't think it's about perfection at all. And later, almost at the last page of the story, Hawthorne writes, "Early in life, Hester had vainly imagined that she herself might be the destined prophetess, but had long since recognized the impossibility that any mission of divine and mysterious truth should be confided to a woman stained with sin, bowed down from shame, or even burdened with a lifelong sorrow. The angel and apostle of the coming revelation must be a woman, indeed, but lofty, pure, and beautiful, and wise, moreover, not thorough dusk grieved, but the ethereal medium of joy, and showing how sacred love should make us happy, and the truest test of a life successful to such an end. So, said Hester Prynne, and glanced her sad eyes downward at the scarlet letter. So I don't know if I take that. I feel like Hester was a great example of this prophetess that, they were looking for. Because, how does anyone know this happiness that it speaks of without knowing the shame and the sorrow that one can go through? Like what is knowledge if not of both sides of that equation, both sin and grace? Some of my other thoughts were, they're early on in the novel, after Hester is shamed in the town square, Hawthorne tries to explain why Hester doesn't leave Boston. And he lays down all this reasoning behind why Hester didn't leave, and over several pages, and sort of likening her to this sort of ghost who kind of haunts this area where something terrible has happened, or something like that. And I always thought, that was, maybe that was the reason. But the other reason I thought, which was much more likely, was because she wanted her lover to see his daughter. She would not give up her lover's name. She obviously cared for him, or at least that was my perception. I was reading the book. He was not some loser, as Hester's character would attest to. She was, quite a strong person. I think she wanted the father to know the child, which I think is strange because Hawthorne gives, again, all these sorts of reasons behind why Hester didn't leave the settlement, but not that one. I think that was the most compelling reason, at least to me. I mean, there was a point where the town even wanted to take Pearl away from her because Pearl was turning into a bit of a little weirdo, as any unsocialized child would be at that age. But, she doesn't leave, and Pearl is her entire world. So, yeah, I just thought that was sort of an interesting thing that didn't get, that wasn't really touched on. That's The Scarlet Letter. I really enjoyed it. Have you read this novel? What are your thoughts? Did you enjoy it as much as I did? Let me know in the comments. And thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you next video.